Tonight on Nation to Nation, Red Dress Day is later this week, and the House had a 4-hour debate on it and the problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
We are seeing constant, unrelenting violence against our women.
Advocates asked for support from all Canadians on that day.
By putting a red light out, letting us know that you're thinking about us.
And the province of Alberta heads to the polls later this month.
Now we're hearing a lot about healthcare, particularly from the United Conservative Party.
Ani Bojo, I'm Annette Francis. Welcome to Nation. Just a few days ago, the House of Commons engaged in a 4-hour debate about Red Dress Day and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The purpose was for the federal government to take note of the various points of view, with the hope quick action will happen. The debate happened the same day after NDP MP Leah Gazan tabled a motion. It asked the feds to immediately create a red dress alert and provide supports to help prevent Indigenous women from going missing or being murdered in the first place. Gazan got the debate rolling. In their initial speeches, the NDP talked about the lack of funding promised in the MMIWG final report's calls to justice.
Speaker, it was a monumental day today, having all members of this House recognize the crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit and trans women, a Canada-wide crisis. Because it is a crisis, Madam Speaker. How many tragedies do we have to endure before appropriate action is taken? We are seeing constant, unrelenting violence against our women.
In their initial speeches, the NDP talked about the lack of funding promised in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls final report's calls to justice.
3 years since it was announced, the federal government's violence prevention strategy is almost mostly unspent to address the crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Only 5%, just $37.1 million out of $724.1 million fund. Not a single new shelter or transitional home has been built. And how much longer do we have to wait for this life-saving money to get out the door? How many lives are going to be lost?
Madam Speaker, it's no secret that this prolonged and continuous genocide is persistent. And it's persistent not only in its forms it's taken, whether it's in violence against women and the results of poverty that we're seeing, but it's also nefarious in its way that the government, for example, operates in. It's nefarious in the fact that they continue to limit the kind of funding that's necessary to get to the organizations that need it most.
There has been generations of targeted lack of investments in investing in Indigenous people's well-being, including lack of investments in housing, in shelters, in social programs that would improve our well-being, including language revitalization, cultural revitalization, and so many more social programs that we know could have better impacts on how we see Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people.
Criticizing the government for its lack of response cross-party lines. Here's Conservative MP Michelle Ferreri during the debate.
And this starts with the federal government implementing its portion of the 231 calls to action, including a standardization of protocols for policies and practices that ensure that all cases are thoroughly investigated, establishing a national task force to review and, if required, to reinvestigate cases across Canada, ensuring protection orders are available, accessible, promptly issued, and effectively serviced and resourced to protect victims.
This is pretty obvious when you have Indigenous women and girls going missing because the only way to get anywhere is to hitchhike. You're vulnerable, you're not safe, there's no public transit. What are you to do? They called for providing safe and reliable public transportation, particularly in our remote and rural areas. They also called for an end to man camps, the resource exploitation camps, where so many times there is not obviously universally, not all the men who work there, but there is a direct correlation between the man camps that build pipelines and dams and also exploit and kill women.
And now it's time to talk about action. We need to make the entire population aware of this issue. It is time to recognize that when we talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, these people are not being treated like everyone else. So an alert system might get people aware that people are not being treated the same way in cases of missing persons. So we are in favor of a red dress alert system.
Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Mark Miller began his response by acknowledging recent events in Winnipeg.
It's timely that we are currently waiting for the results of a study that will provide guidance on the feasibility of searching for the Prairie Green landfill for the remains of women, and I thank the families, community leadership, and the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs for overseeing this work, as well as the advocacy and member of Winnipeg Centre. The discovery of the remains found at the Brady Road landfill recently in Winnipeg and the recent deaths of other Indigenous women have made it terribly clear that we must continue to take action.
Miller went on to explain how the last federal budget reinforced and expanded his government's commitment to missing and murdered Indigenous girls and women. It led to an exchange between Miller and Gazan.
And it proposes an additional $125 million over 6 years, followed by $20 million ongoing, to have measures for implementing the National Action Plan. And this includes, among other things, $1.6 million over the next 2 years to support the creation of Indigenous and Human Rights Ombudsperson.
He talks about all these money, $1.6 million over 50 years, 6 years. He knows very well this funding is completely inadequate. And I'll tell you how I know, Mr. Speaker, because we continue to go missing and be murdered.
Again, Mr. Speaker, that as easy as it is to stand here in this place and talk about historic sums that have been invested, it's equally easy to stand up and dismiss them. But I think the member is accurate on a very important point, that no one in this House should be talking about success until every woman and child and 2S LGBTQ person is Indigenous is safe in this country.
Some people have done that well in the House. I would say that boasting about government announcement at a time of crisis, where we have unanimously in the House called this a Canada-wide crisis, is disturbing to me and makes me question whether this government is talking or whether it's actually going to act.
Coming up after the break, we'll get the lowdown on the Alberta election from one of our own reporters in that province. Stay tuned. The writ dropped May 1st. Albertans are gearing up to head to the polls on May 29th. Our Edmonton correspondent Danielle Paradis is no stranger to politics there, having covered several elections. She joins us now to talk about the election and who's in the run for the province's next premier. Welcome, Danielle.
Hi, Annette.
Are we seeing a lot of candidates in this election, Indigenous candidates specifically?
I'm not aware of a lot of Indigenous candidates, at least there's people who have self-declared. There are two that I wanted to talk about. One in Calgary, her name is Marilyn North Pagan, and her candidacy was actually revoked by the New Democratic Party after she fired off some inflammatory tweets in November last year that called the Calgary Stampede Board corrupt. Previously, she was the first Blackfoot candidate to run for city council in Calgary. So that was one, but again, she is now out. There is someone still in the running in Edmonton, Jody Calahoo Stonehouse, who, like Pagan, is part of the police commission, although for Edmonton rather than Calgary. And she's also she has run in the past, and she's running for NDP in the Edmonton-Rutherford riding. Jody is Cree and Mohawk. She's from Michelle First Nation, and she has been recognized internationally for her anti-racism work and with a company called the Edmonton Shift Lab. She's also ran for the national chief position at the AFN.
What are the chances of one of them or both of them getting in your thoughts?
Well, one is removed from the party, so unless she was to run as an independent, there's not a likelihood that she's going to be in. Jody Calahoo Stonehouse is running in a competitive riding, so I think that she she has her work cut out for her, but she is a well-known name, and so she definitely stands a chance of winning. And she is running in Edmonton, which is a friendlier place for the NDP than Calgary right now.
What sort of election issues are being discussed so far?
Right now, we're hearing a lot about healthcare, particularly from the United Conservative Party. Earlier, there were some discussions about a white paper that Danielle Smith had written, where she says that people should pay for their fees when they go to the doctor's office. She's not quite disavowed that, but she has said, look at my actions. I'm spending a lot of money on healthcare, and I do care about healthcare. But there's still quite a bit of concerns among voters whether or not some of her earlier opinions about healthcare are going to come true. We're also hearing a lot, still under that healthcare envelope, about addiction recovery. So there's been a lot of funding announced, particularly in Enoch. Late in April, there was $30 million announced for an addiction recovery center that would help serve up to 300 people who are struggling to overcome an addiction, and it would treat multiple different addictions, whether it's alcohol or drug related. We're also seeing the conversation about police funding, and from an Indigenous lens, there's been grants given to communities, including First Nations or Métis settlements, about to help them study the viability of setting up their own police force, if that's something that they want to do. So there's been a big discussion about that. In Kainai, the chief there has spoken in support of the UCP based on funds given to them to help set up the police force. Sutina already has their own police force, but other communities in Alberta are looking at the possibility of setting up their own police force too.
Anything Indigenous voters should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, I want to go back to that, to addiction treatment. I think that that's a really important topic for Indigenous voters to have a look at. There's been a lot of conversations, including at Enoch, where Danielle Smith was speaking. She had the chief there with her, Chief Cody Thomas, and there were discussions about involuntary treatment. That's where that's not something that's currently in law, but Smith's government was looking at how they could change the law to allow for involuntary treatment. That would be, as she's described it, based on a Portugal model where there's a commission that people would come before if they've had interactions with the law, and they're also found to be struggling with addiction. And at some point, the commission could determine that the person before them is going to be subject to involuntary treatment. So there's a lot of concern about that, although I would say the chief in Enoch spoke in support. He said people in his community have been experiencing drug-induced psychosis, and that because there are so many issues with drug use, that's a really important, that could be an important tool for them to help get people through addiction and to show them hope. So various opinions on that one.
Have the two major parties come out with how their Indigenous policies will be different from one another yet?
I wouldn't even say that the two parties have come out with policies on Indigenous issues yet. So we are only a few days into the election, but I have not yet seen a lot of discussion from either party on issues that are specifically important to Indigenous communities. As we get closer to the end of the election period, I am hoping we're going to hear about natural resource extraction, for example, and sovereignty. The Sovereignty Act, of course, came into play earlier in the year, and the chiefs in particular for Treaty 6 were very upset about that, but we've yet to hear that at the election level.
How important is this particular election to Indigenous people who live in the province of Alberta?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, every election in Alberta is important. This one is particularly important for looking at two different governing styles. So Danielle Smith, although she's still relatively new as premier, has in the past raised a lot of emphasis on more libertarian values, on smaller government. And then the NDP has focused a lot more on healthcare. They've worked on revitalizing the curriculum for education, which is actually something the UCP worked to do under Jason Kenney as well. But that one fell apart due mostly to a lack of consultation. So there's some really key issues at play. In particular, as you know, Alberta is an oil and gas resource province. And so looking at the dependency on that boom and bust cycle, that's something that we've been needing for years, and something that this election, the next person in charge is going to have to tackle.
Okay, something to watch for. MMIWG, Danielle, thank you for joining us.
Hi.
Time for a break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Earlier this week, advocates and MPs called for a national emergency declaration, saying the issue of missing or murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit in Canada is in a state of crisis. The House of Commons unanimously passed an NDP motion on Tuesday. It demanded that the federal government immediately enact a red dress alert and make substantial investments to support women in crisis. It came just ahead of Red Dress Day, happening this Friday. The Native Women's Association of Canada are hosting their own events on that day. Joining me now is its president, Carol McBride. Welcome.
Hello.
So NWAC has announced its support for the call for a national state of emergency in a motion passed unanimously in Parliament. But how confident are you the passing of that motion will turn into concrete action?
Well, I'm really hoping. How do they say, the proof is in the pudding? So I'm ready to give the government a chance, and I'm based on their actions from here on in, and accountability towards what was passed yesterday. We'll definitely be keeping an eye on that.
NWAC has been circulating an open letter of support for this to get allies to sign on. Has there been much support there, and what would this mean?
Well, first of all, we haven't had much time for what we sent out on Monday. And then, it just so happened that the motion had passed yesterday. So that was very, very good news for us, definitely. And what was so astounding was that it was unanimous, which I think in itself puts pressure on the government.
$150 million in federal funding to women's shelters is set to dry up in September. What types of programs or supports will this affect?
This will definitely affect many programs that's out there that the shelters are providing right now. Maybe shortage of food, a safe place to stay, daycare, this goes on. So it will definitely be a big impact on our families. I'm just hoping that, the government sees fit that it leaves the money there in order to help the families across this country.
Yet on the other hand, the feds recently announced nearly $2 million in funding for 6 Indigenous women's organizations in Quebec for missing and murdered Indigenous women programs. What's your response to that?
Well, I think there's many organizations that can use these monies. NWAC in itself needs money to support some of the provincial programs that we do have, and I'm hoping that we don't get left behind on this, because NWAC, from what I see, has done a lot of work regarding the women's needs. I can't see how this would result in anything good for the families. But I'm just, hoping that NWAC does not get forgotten in all this, and they look at all the good work that we've done.
Mm-hmm. There are many, many other investments needed for this crisis. What do you see as a first priority?
I think what needs to really be done is healing, the healing lodges that we have or we want to have across this country, in terms of, offering programs going to fulfill that need for, whether it's, there's so many facets towards healing. And a lot of these resiliency lodges can undertake some of this healing. And whether it's empowering our women through the resiliency lodges, I think that would be a big benefit to them.
National Red Dress Day events are being planned across the country this week. What does NWAC have planned for the nation's capital region?
Well, first of all, on Friday, we'll be open all day, and we're welcoming people in for sure. There will be a painting unveiled at that time. Minister Miller will be among us to do this, and for sure our NWAC CEO and also the next day we're going to have a chance to have a conversation about what's going on across the country, letting people talk about what they've encountered, what they've suffered, their grieving. So it's going to be an open table to be able to discuss these things. And we have invited Michelle Odette, the senator. She'll be attending as well on Saturday. So it's, I'm really, really looking forward to this. I'm on my way down there tomorrow. It's normally all work but I'm really looking forward to this. I really love meeting people, listening to their stories. So it just gives us a chance to talk, to heal, to grieve. So this is what I'm hoping for.
Okay.
And also I'm also asking all Canadians to recognize this day, by putting a red light out, letting us know that you're thinking about us and that you're supporting us. So that would be, come and visit us. Come and visit us at our NWAC office in Gatineau.
Okay, miigwech for that. Thank you for joining us, Carol McBride.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
That's all for tonight, and if you missed any parts of the show, you can check out our podcast. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. Miigwech, thanks for joining us, and have a good night.